So we went to a wedding in between the lockdowns last summer, and this was the first large gathering that we'd been to since COVID came to Ireland. And what a strange time it was. It was a mixture of celebration, caution, and sanitization. When we were getting our tea and shortbread at the reception, I ended up chatting to a guy and I asked him, "So what do you do?" And he says, "I work in a meat factory." I couldn't help asking. I said, are you worried about all the outbreaks? And he says, "Yeah, I had COVID actually." Silence. As I work out, is it appropriate to ask when, or do I just run away? To top it all off, when we sat down for dinner, I get quite excited about the wedding favour bag, and I was hoping for sweets, or at the very least, a scented candle. But instead, all I got was a personalised hand sanitizer. And I thought to myself, is this a wedding party or a clinic? In John 2, we're taken to another wedding, and they're also thinking about the topic of cleanness. What is it that makes you clean? Not just on the outside, but in our souls. Maybe you're like one friend of mine who struggles to believe that God could really accept him. Because of some of the things that he's done in the past, he finds it hard to trust that God could love him. These Christians are saying that you just need to trust in Jesus, and he's doing that as hard as he can, but is that enough? John 2 tells us that we can be sure about where we stand with God. This passage that we're going to read today, it gives us something massive to look forward to. And it also gives us something to enjoy right now in the middle of lockdown. So a little bit of context about John. This miracle comes early in John's account of Jesus' life. It's the first miracle that he records. And John wrote this book for a very specific reason. He tells us in the end of his book, in chapter 20, that he wrote it so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So basically everything in this book points to Jesus' identity as the promised rescuer. The strange thing is, the first sign that John records isn't some crazy life or death situation. There aren't any lions being wrestled here. It's a completely unnecessary miracle. A wedding that runs out of wine is a little bit embarrassing, but nobody's life is in danger. In this story, Jesus rescues the wedding, and he does it by taking over the job of the groom. The funny thing is, we barely even meet the couple who got married because Jesus eclipses them. But why does John want to show us how good a groom Jesus is? Jesus never even got married. Or did he? So to help us walk through this, I've divided the passage into two parts as we walk through it together. So in part 1, it's verses 1 to 5. And in this part, we're going to see they're out of wine, but it's not Jesus' time. So in verse 1, John drops us into this wedding at Cana, and Jesus is there, his mother Mary is there, and his followers. So it must have been some kind of family friend or a relative, because that's the reason they got the invite. And interestingly, Jewish weddings last a very long time. They could actually last up to a full week. Mary's on the catering committee. We know this because she's one of the first to know that they ran out of wine. Who's to blame? This is entirely the groom's fault, because in contrast to how we do weddings in Ireland, the groom is the main organizer. At my wedding, I made the mistake of dropping the rings, but this level of mistake is on the next level. And running out of wine is one way to make sure that the guests don't stay very long. It would kind of make the young couple a bit of a joke, and it would be seen as a bad start to the marriage. But Mary thinks Jesus can help. Remember who Mary is and what she's experienced. Remember that the angel Gabriel told her that the child that she would give birth to would be God's son. And she has seen how different Jesus has been as he's grown up. So she runs over to Jesus and she says to him in verse 3, Jesus, we're out of wine. But he says in verse 4, woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. What's going on here? Is Jesus being rude to Mary? He's not being rude, but he's clearly tense about something. So what is this hour that he's talking about? Somebody called Tim Keller is really helpful in explaining this tension about Jesus' hour. And he says that when you're at weddings, what do you think of? You tend to be reminded of your own wedding if you're married, or you imagine what your wedding might be like. You might wonder if you'll ever get married. And Keller says that Jesus is also thinking about his wedding, but he knows when it's going to be. And even more, Jesus knows what's going to have to happen before he gets to his wedding. In the New Testament, there's a picture that appears the whole way through, and it's of the church as a bride and Jesus as the groom who loves his bride and marries her. The point of this picture is to basically show that Jesus is so closely connected to the church, to his church, that marriage is the only way you could really describe it. That's how close the union is. But to get to this ultimate wedding, where Jesus is going to be united to his church, something has to happen first. Jesus has to die. And that's why when Mary says, we're out of wine, Jesus says, it's not my time. It's not time for him to die just yet. Jesus has only just started his mission. He's got to gather his followers. He's got to get them ready. He's only just getting started. And he's thinking of all these things that he has to go through before the church will be his bride. But Mary doesn't realize this. How could she at this point? And what she says in verse 5 is lovely. She says, basically, I don't know what this all means, but I believe you can help us now, Jesus. And she says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. And thankfully for the bride and groom at this wedding, Jesus steps up and he takes over the groom's job. And this is going to point to his ultimate wedding to his church. So let's see how. In part 2, we're looking at verses 6 to 11. And in Jesus' time, washing jars are filled with wine. In verse 6, John talks about these 6 big stone jars that are in the building, and they're ceremonial washing jars. What's that? In Jewish tradition, hand washing was a really big thing, and this went back to Exodus 17 in the Bible, where God told Moses and Aaron that they need to wash their hands and feet before they can go into the special tent where they meet with God. Over time, this rule was gradually branched out. Rabbis gradually extended hand washing to other places, for example, after you leave a graveyard, before you eat your meal, after you eat, when you wake up in the morning, and loads more times. The idea is that you need to make yourself spiritually clean to be able to approach God, because in your current state, you're not. We're used to this constant hand washing now, but the aim of Jewish hand washing isn't to kill germs. They believe that washing removes the sin that makes you unclean. And this idea of needing to reset and return ourselves to a healthy spiritual state is actually surprisingly familiar in our culture. We'll use words like balance, recenter, restore wellness to do basically the same ritual. There was an article in the Fingal Independent last week that was talking about how people are getting through lockdown 3. And they interviewed a group of people, And the really interesting thing was that almost all of them said that they spent time meditating each day to recenter themselves. Isn't that the same thing? They're aware that they're not okay and they need to do something about it multiple times a day, just like hand washing. But in verse 7, Jesus shocks them. He tells the servants to fill up these big jars with water. What's he doing? Doesn't Jesus know that these are special jars? You can't use those. And then he gives them a fright and he says, dip a cup in there and take it to the master of the banquet. The master of the banquet is like the venue manager. He's the boss who's making sure everything is running smoothly. Imagine being the servant who has to bring this new, untested drink over to him, knowing that it came from one of those old jars, and you're wondering if you're about to get fired for serving dirty dishwater. But in verse 9, the master tastes it, and he's really impressed. Jesus' special wine has upped the tone of this entire wedding. It's the best yet. And the funny thing is that he calls the groom. So he calls over the groom. Remember this guy, the guy that should never have allowed any of this to happen. And he congratulates the groom on something that he didn't do. And he says, well done. You've saved the best wine until last. But we know it's nothing to do with what this groom did. And at this point, it becomes clear just what Jesus has done here. These water jars were huge. We're told that they held between 80 and 120 litres. So Jesus has just made over 600 litres of wine. That's over 600 bottles. That would fill my oil tank. And I googled how long it takes to make a decent Cabernet Sauvignon. And apparently, according to Google, it takes about 10 years for it to mature and get right. And yet Jesus makes the best wine instantly. And he makes a silly, ridiculous amount of it. They're never going to get through this much wine in the remaining days of the feast. So this leaves us all with a big question. Why? As somebody once asked, what does Cabernet have to do with Christ? Why is John dying to tell us this story when he could have started with something a bit more dramatic, like raising Lazarus from the dead? And in verse 11, we find out the answer. John says, it's a sign. It's to point to something more. The key to this passage is in verse 4, where Jesus talks about his hour. And in Jesus' time, washing jars get filled with wine. We moved house a few months ago, and when we moved into our new house, I claimed the spare room as Josh's office. And I got it all set up really nicely. It's got my desk, books, a box of chargers and pens, and everything that I need for productivity. But its identity was changed as soon as that first box of nappies was dumped in it. And now it's just called Baby's Room. Jesus has come to give the washing jars a new job description, just like my room. Their old job is finished. They're not even water jars anymore. These are party jars. Jesus has given them a new purpose, and he's pressed the override button. And by replacing the purpose of the jars, Jesus gives us a glimpse of what it is that he came to do for us. So there's 2 points of application for how we can apply this to our lives. The first is this. Jesus has come to make us permanently clean. All this ceremonial washing will be made redundant because you won't be in any doubt that you're clean enough to meet with God. Right now, with COVID, we have to stop at every single shop and pump hand sanitizer onto our cracked knuckles to ceremonially remove COVID from our hands. But imagine if COVID just disappeared overnight. Suddenly, the things we've been doing for the last year, like queuing outside shops, wearing face masks, constant hand sanitizing, they would become irrelevant. But you might still be tempted to do those things just in case. But we can have total confidence that Jesus has removed our uncleanness. All that guilt and shame and sin that we have in our lives is paid for and is washed away. How? Because Jesus is able to wash us with something that's better than water. Just before he goes to die on the cross in Matthew 26, it says, "Then he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins.'" In filling the jars with wine, he's pointing to his death, and he's pointing to how his blood washes away our sins. Water is only a temporary fix. When the Jews went home after that wedding, they need to go through the whole same thing again. They need to wash their hands again before bed to remind themselves that they're constantly unclean. But when you follow Jesus, his blood clings to you forever and it makes you clean. And that's why John puts in this seemingly unnecessary detail in verse 7 when Jesus says, "Fill them up to the brim." There's no more room for any water in these jars. And this is what Christianity is all about. Many of us go through periods of wondering if we really are Christians because we still feel a lot of shame and guilt. And I think the truth is, we'd probably prefer to do something about it ourselves. We like the idea of ceremonially washing our hands or sprinkling holy water or asking God to come back into our lives every week. But the reality is, once you receive the Holy Spirit, he will never leave you. This miracle shows that we can be sure that Jesus makes us permanently clean. We can have total assurance and security. It means that when you look back at that thing that you did, which you're totally ashamed of, you can be sure that it's paid for and it's got no more hold over you. Because of Jesus, we can be confident that when we pray to God, he's our Father in heaven who loves us and is delighted that we're coming to him. The second way that we can apply this passage to us comes out of the first way. So because Jesus has made us permanently clean, we can celebrate that we're invited to Jesus' wedding feast. I'm probably the only person saying this today in the middle of lockdown, but I think this passage is telling us to put on our party shoes, if you have party shoes. Jesus floods this wedding with wine to show how much joy and celebrating there's going to be at his never-ending party when he makes all things new. The end of the Bible gives us a little peek into a wedding that's happening in the future in Revelation 19. It says, "Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory. For the marriage of the Lamb," that's Jesus, "has come, and his bride," and that includes Donabate and Balbriggan Presbyterian churches, "has made herself ready. And the angel has said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb." This is the ultimate feast that we're going to, where we're celebrating Jesus rescuing and marrying his church, and that's us. This is incredible hope for the future. This picture of the new heavens and the new earth is of a giant party that never ends. We'll be sitting with God at God's table, enjoying being with him and with all of his people. And we'll be eating delicious foods like beautiful chicken wings and curry chips and jam donuts. Those are my favorite foods, so I hope we'll be eating things like that. And we'll be drinking the best wine. And even better news is that the wedding has started already. We can enjoy some of it now. Jesus has gathered and he is gathering his people. And there are loads more people in Balbriggan that he has invited, and that we need to go out and tell them that it's happening. Jesus has already done the hard work for us. We've actually already got a first taste of the feast. And this really hit home for me a few weeks ago when we celebrated the Balbriggan 1 year birthday service. And at the service, we asked everybody what their favourite memory of church was so far. And most people said it was just getting together, having barbecues and the International Food Night. And that's no coincidence. These were tastes of Jesus' wedding feast, where we're having beautiful fellowship with his people in his presence. And you might even have been sitting beside the same person that you'll be sitting beside at his wedding feast. We've been made clean enough to go to Jesus' wedding. I hope you feel excited about that. Let's remind each other this week that this is where we're going. Let's enjoy the first tastes of the feast now by sharing our lives with each other. And let's think about our other friends and how we can invite them to join us at Jesus' wedding feast.